Welcome, everyone, to Academics of PA. I'm here with Bruce.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm good. How are you?
Oh, not too shabby for a Friday in the summer.
It's nice out, too. I'm ready to get to the pool. But first, we want to introduce a podcast that you recorded with John Mikesell.
Yeah, we recorded at the end of March. The audio quality is probably not the best on it because we recorded it over the phone rather than by our normal microphone means. But it was a neat kind of conversation to sit down and talk with him for a little bit about his experience in terms of why he went into academia, where he came up with the idea for his book, his movie career, and even the Mikesell vodka that you can find out there.
I think everyone's going to be excited about those last 2 points in particular. I know I am.
Cool. You want to give it a listen?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Hi, good afternoon.
Hello.
How are you doing, sir?
I'm fine.
Thank you for joining us on Academics of PA.
Well, glad to talk with you.
There's a couple different questions that my co-host and I have come up with that we wanted to ask. One of them is that your academic background is a little bit different from a lot of people in public administration or public affairs programs because you are actually an economist. So kind of wanted to ask what drove you to going into economics and then what it's like being an economist in a PA program.
Well, I was a economics major at Wildavsky College, which it was and is still an all-male school, and very serious academically. There was no such thing as public administration, and I probably wouldn't have been interested in it, even if there was. Being an all-male school, we a lot of time we weren't studying, playing touch football, basketball, and arguing. And when I was a junior, the state of Indiana, the legislature, was passing the first retail sales tax in the state's history and also the first individual income tax in the state's history. And that was the topic of many arguments, as you might guess, and felt a little unarmed because I mostly done pure economic theory kinds of things. During that summer, I didn't have anything particularly productive to do, so I enrolled in a political science course at Indiana University on state and local government, and an economics course in public finance. And the two things sort of went together, and I guess I was sort of leaning in that direction, or rather applied focus from that time on. Although, of course, I did my doctoral work in economics, and I think that gave me a good background for understanding policy and for also understanding some things about human behavior that probably matter a bit in what goes on in public administration. So I guess that's my thought is. And in terms of being an economist in a public administration program, I suppose that could be an issue in some public administration programs, but Indiana University is large in terms of numbers of faculty, and we have a considerable number of economists who are working in the public finance area. So there's always been at least one kindred spirit to work with. So it's not been uncomfortable at all. In fact, in some regards, I think that probably some of the people in other areas think that we gang up on the rest. So I'm not sure that it's ever regarded as a special issue. And of course, my specialty is public finance. There is as time has gone by, worked into a considerable community of public finance scholars and practitioners around the world. In that club, there are political scientists and there are economists, and everything seems to work pretty well.
Okay. Well, it certainly does kind of make sense that PA is kind of interdisciplinary, so we do bring in a lot of different perspectives from different areas.
Yeah, but it's important that everybody works within the strengths of their own discipline. If you try to create some sort of a marble fudge of a result with people trying to create a commonality, I'm not sure that works pretty well. There are things that economists do better than political scientists, and some things that political science do better than economists. And it seems to me that it makes a lot of sense that everybody sort of stay in their lanes as they're keeping the overall highway going in the same direction. If that makes any sense at all.
I think so. If we look back at the intellectual history, political science in the United States emerged out of the American Economic Association. Public administration emerged out of the American Political Science Association. And we kind of fall, at least, the public administration probably maybe halfway between economics and political science, trying to kind of pick up the best of both worlds in some way.
Yeah. Back in the days when SPIA was creating its PhD in public affairs, I was the associate dean for academic affairs, and I essentially wrote the initial proposal for the degree. And I very consciously tried to get a mix of economics and political science in the program, because it seemed to me that was likely to create the strongest graduates that we could produce. As the years went by, we've moved away a bit from that model, and we've done probably more of the work internally than we did in those early days. But still, you can see the skeleton from that kind of merging of disciplinary approaches in the degree.
Certainly. In terms of thinking about the changes that have happened, not only in your career at IU, but kind of more broadly academically, how have you seen the realm of public finance and kind of its relation back to MPA programs change over the years?
Well, when I came to SPIA initially, it was in the first year of its operation. I wasn't on the faculty in the fall when the first students came in, but I was there in the spring. And there was an MPA program, and it had a course in public budgeting, I guess they called it. And I started, one of the interesting things was a number of us in that first group of faculty didn't really have any experience in public administration programs. And the dean, Chuck Bonser, was really interested in developing a new and stronger program. And essentially a lot of us were making it up as we went along. We didn't have any models that we thought were acceptable. So we were just sort of flying by the seat of our pants. And when I was assigned the responsibility of teaching the budgeting course, I did a little cruising around to see what other programs had, programs that I'd heard of, like the usual suspects. And I discovered they were using essentially Wildavsky's politics and budget process. And I looked at it and I thought, okay, the MPA is supposed to be a kind of an applied degree that seems to me ought to provide its graduates with a foundation and then give them a leg up in terms of skills. They'll be able to proceed knowing what to do when they're employed, and will have a good foundation that will allow them to move up in the organization as time passes. And after reading the politics of the budgetary process, I thought, well, this doesn't tell me how to do anything. It doesn't even give me any sort of suggestion. I might as well have spent my time reading War and Peace. And also, one of the things we were doing was we were the administrating unit for the Intergovernmental Personnel Act in Indiana, which financed technical assistance and training programs for state and local public officials. So I spent a lot of time out and about talking with public finance practitioners in the state, and I realized that what was in those public budgeting courses wasn't helping those people at all. There was nothing about where the money comes from. There was nothing about public debt and borrowing. There wasn't anything about pension program management. There were just a bunch of war stories about going out after money and a little bit about spending it. So I made a substantial shift in what that course was at Indiana. And then over time, we proceeded to add more specific coursework in the budgeting and finance field. So that within 3 or 4 years, we went from having that one budgeting course to having a budgeting course that covered the full array of financial administration responsibilities. But then we also had a specialty course in revenue policy administration, a specialty course in budget and program analysis, a specialty course in debt policy, a course in benefit cost analysis. And that produced, it seems to me, a set of graduates that were far superior to anything that any other program was producing. I mean, in my estimation, we had the best public finance program starting sometime in the late 70s, early 80s. It wasn't just when the U.S. News and World Report folks finally recognized 4 or 5 years ago. We just had the faculty depth and the coursework depth as well as the research that was pretty much unmatched. And I'm happy to say that it seems to me that there are a lot of other good programs out there that have followed our lead and added the depth that's appropriate for the importance of the general field out in practice and in research.
Now, in terms of kind of thinking about your experience teaching budgeting, in the early 80s, you had your first edition of the Fiscal Administration book come out.
Yeah, which is way different than it is now, because I was following the principle of the early days of SPIA. I had no idea what I was doing, but I was pretty sure that I could do better than anything that was out there and available. In fact, it started as a revulsion against a textbook that came out about that time, and I used it one semester, and about halfway through the course, I said to myself, I can dictate a better public finance text than this. And that's how the first edition of my text started. It was, in fact, a combination of dictation and taped lectures.
Huh.
Possibly a sad admission, but it's exactly true. I can put you on the trail of the secretary that had to transcribe that.
I don't think it's a sad thing. I think compared to the other books that were out at the time, as you said, they didn't really cover how to do budgeting. I think that's a problem that a lot of the books that still come out.
My competitors haven't figured out that public finance and budgeting is a participatory adventure. Mm-hmm. And lecturing and having them read assignments isn't going to get the graduates up and ready to roll. That they need to crank through some problems and exercises. And some of the exercises and some of the things that are taught in the book are, when you get right down to it, pretty simple applications. But if you've never done that kind of thing before, and that's the job assignment that you face, it sure is comforting to say to yourself, aha, I know the technique to use here, and I can apply it. And my son is a fiscal analyst with the city council in Seattle, Washington, and he's been in a couple of other places, and he's in the office with people who graduated from other top-ranked public administration programs. And he says it's very often the case that they'll get an assignment and be able to proceed with doing the work. And people from the other programs say, Tom, how did you know how to do that? And he says, well, I learned it in my MBA program.
Now, did he learn his MBA program, or did you teach that to him when he was a kid?
He was in our MBA program. He's a graduate of both our undergraduate and graduate programs.
Okay.
He has a rather interesting situation. My father was a accounting professor at Indiana for 39 years and wrote the standard governmental accounting textbook at that time. Now I guess the 17th edition. And then there's a different author of it identified as being the continuation of what the book that my father started. Anyway, my son used that textbook when he was doing governmental accounting, and he used my textbook when he was doing his public finance course. So he has probably a major distinction of being one of the few people who have used textbooks written by both their grandfather and their father.
That is kind of interesting. If I can ask, what is it about taxation that has captured your attention, considering that has been the predominant area of your research for at least the past few years?
Well, it seems to me that is really the key, unique function of government, the ability to raise revenue by coercion. Lots and lots of entities can spend, private sector, nonprofit, government. Everybody can spend. It doesn't take any particular skill to spend. It does take some skill to spend wisely, and it does take skill to manage and to make choices. But it's not a unique governmental function. Taxation is the true pearl, the true unique feature of government, the ability to, in a market economy, to obtain resources by coercion. So that makes it a particularly critical thing for government operations, and it makes it a particularly critical thing to get right. Because if you take resources away from people, really you need to make sure you've thought it through. It's not just, well, if we levy the tax, we can raise $10 million a year. Any fool can do that. The real test is, can you raise that money in a way that produces the least collateral damage? Because, basically, a tax is about damaging the private sector. And so you want to make sure that you create as little damage as you possibly can. That has to do with questions of stability and in terms of distortion of economic choices, in terms of equity of distribution. So the basic key of taxation is to get the government to operate like a pickpocket as opposed to operating like a mugger. You don't want to leave the economy bruised and battered. You just want to take the money with as little other impact as possible. And tell me that trying to figure out how to do that's not an interesting question? Seems to me that is the interesting question of all of public administration. And it's the absolute unique question in public administration. Everything else, there are differences, obviously, between private, public, and third sector kinds of operations, but it's not really fundamentally different. The stuff about raising those resources, there's a huge difference.
Okay. If someone who was a PhD student or a junior scholar came up to you and they were interested in kind of getting into doing research on this area, where would you point them to, or what advice would you give them?
Do a lot of thinking. Make sure the first thing you do is, if you say, I'm interested in state income taxes, first do a whole lot of background research to make sure you absolutely understand what the taxes are, what their structures are, the way that they're administered, and so on. That's the critical part, in my estimation. It's not, oh, gee, I found a bunch of data. It's, well, here's an important question, and I can see some differences in the way that jurisdictions do the tax. I can see some ways that how the tax operates has changed over time. Now, what kind of data from what kinds of various sources can I marshal to shed light on what I think are the problem areas? And that seems to me is the basic idea in doing any kind of particularly policy-relevant research in in taxation or in any other area of public finance. I'm not a fan of downloading data that somebody else has generated and using modern econometrics to test some hypothesis that I've ginned up.
Now, do you see that more of the research is being directed towards just downloading the data, and that presents a little bit of concern about getting the legal?
Yeah, downloading the data is the easy part. The hard part is figuring out what the important questions are. I remember I was giving a paper at a Association for Budget and Financial Management, a conference a few years ago. And it was a sales tax paper, as is almost always the case in my work. Sometimes a property tax paper will show up. And I was explaining the data that I used to analyze the question that was interesting to me. And I started out with the sales tax collection by state that the Census Bureau, Government's Division, produces annually. And then I said that, of course, you can't stop with that because it's important to standardize the data to get a degree of consistency across states. That's important because states have peculiarities in how they define the law. Sometimes they'll exempt a particular category of consumption from the retail sales tax, but then they'll turn around and have a absolutely equivalent selected excise on that excluded category. And to say that their sales tax base is narrow because they're using the census data just is wrong for that state. And the census has some unusual kinds of accounting conventions that you need to know and make adjustments for. And I went through a few of the adjustments that I do. And this is data since 1970, so there are lots and lots of adjustments. And one person in the audience held up their hand and said, "That sounds like a lot of work." And I looked at him and I said, "That's called research. Don't you understand?" Well, that's the kind of point. You got to absolutely know your data, and you got to know the way the data is generated, and you got to know the way the data is collected. And if you're working on the basis of data that you've downloaded from somebody else's collection, you may be ambushing yourself.
Okay. Now, in terms of thinking about your career, you've definitely spent a lot of time at IU, but you've also done a lot of work with different countries on their financial questions and issues that have arose up over time.
Yeah. One of the interesting things is when you write a public finance textbook, as I have, you, by requirement, have to know the ins and outs of a whole lot of different portions of government finance.
Mm-hmm.
I know sales and property taxes very well. Sales tax is better than anyone else on the face of the earth, probably. And my reputation in the United States is primarily as a sales tax guy. When I worked with USAID projects in Ukraine and in Russia, I was an intergovernmental fiscal relations person. When I worked with the World Bank on fiscal reform projects in several of the countries of Central Asia, I was a budget process guy. So I've done, I think, good things in each one of those areas that I'm proud of. My friend and colleague Dan Mullins and I, for instance, wrote the budget process law for the Kyrgyz Republic some years ago. They had never been able to produce an executable budget in the history of the entire country. I mean, yeah, it was not a big deal. I mean, because they didn't have a country until 1990, so it's not like in 1776. But he and I, sitting there in the World Bank office, wrote the budget process law. That worked. The budgets got adopted. They got executed as they were adopted. They had got their deficits under control, and it worked marvelously. Now, the Kyrgyz Republic had one of the color revolutions back some years ago, a new the new reform administration eliminated the budget process. And so they went back to deficit situations. But that's another story. And when I was in Russia, Roy Ball and I, along with a Russian colleague, created a fiscal interrelationship between the regional governments and the localities that the National Ministry of Finance adopted as the standard for all the subjects of the Russian Federation, which we thought was pretty cool. And of course, when Putin came in, he eliminated all that structure. But while it was there, it was working marvelously. So I worked in a variety of areas, and it's because I know a lot about a few things, and I know enough to get along pretty darn well in some of the other areas.
Mm-hmm. Now, if someone came and asked you kind of how you would advise them, what recommendations you would give to them to get involved, not necessarily internationally, but perhaps with a local government area, or even with the state, as you did with Indiana, is there any advice or recommendations that you would give them, given that a lot of communities are very hesitant about letting outsiders get involved or people outside the government with their budget and their financial decisions?
Right. Well, I think just being around helps a bit. And then when an opportunity presents itself, as it will often do, particularly if a number of your students graduate and go to work in state government, that kind of gives you a bit of an avenue. I worked for, 40-some years as a revenue forecaster for the state of Indiana. And I got into that position because they set up a process in which they wanted an academic tax economist on a consensus revenue forecasting commission. And the first two people that they wanted didn't want to do it. And they finally ended up asking me, and I said, sure, why not? And that was great because the people that I met in that body were people who knew about tax and public finance systems in the state of Indiana, and they gave me insights into how tax systems work. And if I needed some data, they were always willing to help me get the data. And of course, doing revenue forecasts, I just automatically got a bunch of data. And so I think the major thing is to don't say no when someone comes and asks you if you'd like to try something.
Okay, that's definitely good advice. I do have kind of a strange question that one of your former students suggested that we ask you, and that is about you being a famous movie star.
Well, I suppose they're referring to the fact that I do appear in the movie Breaking Away, the movie about a bicycle race in Indiana University that sometime in the 1970s or so. My entire family and I were in the movie as extras, of course, but we were in the front row of the start of the road race in the movie. That's about as movie star-ish as I can get. However, we were paid extras, if that counts.
So you never considered a career change over to the film industry?
I did not think about making that career change because I think the pay was on the order of $16 for a full day's work. But my son, who was at that time probably about 3 years old, he got the $16 too, so that was good wages for him.
That's pretty decent for a kid.
Yeah.
There was one other question that was passed along to us, and that is that evidently there's a brand of vodka that is named after you.
Well, I spent time living in Russia as well as in Ukraine, and Russians are amazingly creative people. And one of my counterparts there produced a bottle of vodka with a special Mikesell vodka label on it that has a picture of myself and my wife on it. which is pretty impressive. I have never opened it. I'm pretty sure that it's probably good vodka because that's one thing that Russians know how to do is make vodka. But it was an extremely limited release, shall we say. And the various Grey Goose and so on have nothing to worry about from Mikesell vodka.
You probably could have made a pretty penny selling it at ABFM each fall.
Actually, that's not a bad idea. I'm still in contact with some people there. I could see what they could produce, maybe a case or so, and distribute it there. But I suspect there will be a few tax and licensing considerations that there might be a problem. Not something the Russians ever much worry about, by the way.
True. But I suppose you are a tax expert, so you should be able to help us work through that, right?
Yeah, that's right. At least I'd feel guilty about there not being any tax on it.
Yeah, I don't think many people would pay that much attention to the tax side when it comes to alcohol if they could get away with it.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you for joining me today. It's been a pleasure having you on our show.
It's been good talking with you, Bruce.